Welcome back to Dark Horror Stories. In today's episode, I'm sharing 7 deeply unsettling stories from small-town nights, those quiet, forgotten places where the dark feels closer than it should, and the things that live in it don't always stay hidden. These are accounts from people who thought they knew their towns, their roads, their woods. They were wrong. Get comfortable, turn the lights up if you need to, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Story 1. There's a stretch of road on the south end of Hallow Creek that everyone who grew up there knows about. Not because anything famous happened there, no accident, no history anyone ever bothered writing down. You just knew, the same way you knew not to swim in the reservoir past sundown or to never park your car facing the old grain elevator at night. The road runs about 2 miles between the trailer park where I grew up and the Dollar General where I worked my first job at 16. Most nights I walked it. Most nights it was fine. I was 23 the summer I moved back home after college didn't quite work out the way I'd planned. My mom had taken a second job in the city doing medical billing, so the house was usually empty by the time I got off my shift at the hardware store. I'd started walking home around 10 or 11 at night. It seemed fine. I'd done it 100 times as a kid, and I wasn't exactly in the mood to ask anyone for rides. I had too much pride for that, honestly. Still do, my girlfriend will tell you. She thinks that pride is going to get me killed someday. It was July. The kind of hot that doesn't let go even after midnight, where the air feels like something damp pressed against your face. I remember the smell of cut grass and diesel from the highway a mile east. I had my earbuds in for maybe the first half of the walk. I was listening to some podcast about unsolved disappearances, which feels ironic now, and then I took them out because I got the feeling you get sometimes. The feeling that something changed while you weren't paying attention. The road was quiet. No cars, which wasn't unusual for that time of night. The streetlights out there are spaced far apart, so you walk through long patches of dark between pools of orange light. I'd never minded that before. I grew up with it. But that night one of the lights in the middle stretch was out, and the dark between the 2 working lights felt like it was about 100 yards long instead of 40 or 50. I slowed down a little, not because I was scared, I told myself. I just wanted to hear better, I guess. There was a sound. I thought at first it was coming from the cornfield off the east shoulder, like something moving through the stalks. A deer, I figured. Raccoon, something ordinary. I kept walking. The sound didn't stop when I passed the field. That was the first thing that struck me as wrong. Animals don't shadow you. They move away or they freeze, but they don't pace you step for step. I pulled out my phone for the flashlight, which felt like overkill. I didn't want to look ridiculous, even with nobody watching. I pointed the light at the ditch line. There was nothing there. Weeds, a crushed mountain toucan, the rusted fence post that had been leaning like that since I was a kid. I kept moving. The sound kept moving with me. The thing was, and this part still bothers me years later, the sound was footsteps. I know how that sounds. You can talk yourself into hearing a lot of things out in the dark, but these were footsteps. Deliberate, unhurried footsteps matching my pace almost exactly. When I slowed, they slowed. When I sped up a little, they stayed even. I finally stopped dead in the road and held my breath. The footsteps stopped a beat after I did, not at the same time, a beat after. I turned the flashlight toward the east shoulder and held it there for what felt like a full minute. The ditch was empty. The corn was still. The fence ran in a straight line back toward the dark. And then I noticed about 15 feet from where I stood, a stretch of ground beside the road where the tall grass was pressed flat in a rough oval, like something had been standing there, weight pressed into the soft ground along the ditch. I told myself it was where deer slept sometimes. I had, in fact, seen deer bedding down along that stretch before. It was a perfectly good explanation. I kept walking faster this time. The footsteps started up again, still behind me, still matching my pace, still on the east side of the road. But now they sounded closer. And now there was something wrong with the rhythm of them, like there were too many, maybe. Like the pattern wasn't quite right for 2 feet. I didn't count them. I was too focused on not running, which I had decided would be the wrong choice. I'm not sure why. Some stubborn part of me refused to give whatever was the satisfaction. I was maybe a quarter mile from the first houses at the edge of town when I finally looked back. There was nothing there, but the flashlight caught the road surface, and on the left shoulder, the side I was walking on, I saw what put me over the edge. There were impressions in the gravel shoulder. Not footprints exactly. More like pressure marks spaced out in a way that didn't suggest a normal walking pattern. The distance between them was too long, like whatever made them had a stride almost twice the length of a person's. They were leading toward me. They stopped a few feet from where I currently stood. I ran the rest of the way home. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the kitchen with every light on and the television up loud, drinking bad instant coffee and watching the driveway through the window until 5 in the morning turned the sky gray. I told myself I'd been tired, that I'd spooked myself listening to that stupid podcast, that I'd imagined the sound keeping pace with me, which was probably just echo off the asphalt doing something strange. The next morning I went back. I know, believe me. But I went back in daylight, and I walked that stretch, and I found the oval of pressed grass in the ditch, and I found those impressions in the gravel shoulder again, closer together in the daylight, or maybe I'd miscounted, but there were 7 of them, leading in my direction, stopping where I'd stopped, and at the end of the last impression, sunk into the dust at the very edge of the pavement, there was a single elongated mark like something had knelt down or crouched. I don't walk that road at night anymore. I moved out of Hallow Creek the following spring, and I haven't been back except once for my cousin's wedding, and even then I made sure to be back at the hotel before dark. My girlfriend thinks I have an irrational fear of rural roads. I let her think that. Story 2. Orchard County, if you've never been, is the kind of place that smells like apples and wood smoke from October through February. The main street has a diner, a hardware store, a church with a broken marquee, and a bar that nobody under 60 seems to go to. My grandmother lived there her whole life. My mother grew up there. I grew up in the suburbs 3 hours east, and I only visited in the summers, which meant I knew Orchard County the way you know a photograph. The surface of it, the pretty parts, none of what was underneath. My grandmother passed when I was 28. She left the house to my mother, who wasn't in any condition to deal with it. She'd been going through a rough stretch, nothing I need to get into, so it fell to me to go out and start sorting through 63 years of accumulated life. I took 2 weeks off from my job, which I was behind on anyway, packed a bag, and drove out in early November. The leaves were already down. The sky had that flat white look that means you're weeks away from serious cold. The house was a white farmhouse on Siller Road, set back from the pavement about 1/8 of a mile. My grandmother had kept a kitchen garden and a row of apple trees that were so old their trunks had gone gray and knobbled. There was a barn that hadn't held animals since the 1980s and a root cellar that nobody in my family had opened since I could remember. I'd always been a little fascinated by that root cellar as a kid. The kind of fascination where you want to open the door but also absolutely don't. The first 2 days were ordinary, sad and dusty and ordinary. I'd wake up early because the furnace made a sound like someone knocking from inside the walls. I figured the pipes needed bleeding, which I kept meaning to look up, and I'd drink coffee from my grandmother's old percolator, which made coffee that tasted almost right but not quite. I found a recipe box. I found about 40 years of National Geographic stacked in the guest room. I found a coffee can full of Canadian coins she'd apparently been collecting since the 70s. On the 3rd night, I heard something in the yard. It was maybe 2 in the morning. I'd been going to bed early because there was nothing else to do, and I'd woken up for no particular reason the way you sometimes do in an unfamiliar house. I lay there for a minute thinking about nothing, and then I heard it, a sound like something being dragged across gravel. The sound stopped, started again, stopped. I told myself it was an animal. There were deer in the area. I'd seen them crossing the road the day I arrived. They bumped into things, moved erratically, made sounds at night that you couldn't quite identify in the half-dark of sleeping. I turned over and tried to go back to sleep. The sound changed. It became something more like tapping, rhythmic, very deliberate, against what I eventually identified as the root cellar doors. The root cellar had old wooden slant doors set flush against the house foundation, the kind with a metal latch on the outside. The tapping was on the underside of those doors, from below. I lay there for about 10 minutes just listening, fully awake, telling myself there were probably animals that could get under foundations, skunks, groundhogs, something like that, and they'd gotten into the cellar through some gap I hadn't noticed yet. The tapping was slow and even enough that I could count the intervals. 3 seconds between each tap, give or take. That was what kept me from going out there. Animals don't count. Animals don't maintain rhythm. Whatever I was hearing, the pauses between each tap were almost exactly the same length every single time. It stopped around 3. I didn't sleep after that. The next morning I went around to the root cellar and unlatched the doors and stood there in the November light looking down the wooden steps. It smelled like old earth and something faintly sweet, which I tried to tell myself was rotting apples. There were no animals. There was no sign anything had been down there recently, no disturbance in the fine layer of dust on the steps, no tracks in the soft dirt floor. The shelves held mason jars going back decades. Everything was still, but the inside surface of the cellar doors, the underside, the wood that faced down into the dark, was scratched in a pattern I had to crouch down to see clearly. Not random scratches. Lines arranged in a grid, maybe 100 of them in tight rows, like something had been marking time. I couldn't tell you how long that would take to make. I couldn't tell you when it had been made. But I know what I heard the night before, and I know where I heard it coming from. I packed the recipe box and my grandmother's photo albums. I called a real estate agent from the driveway. I did not go back into that house. The agent left me 2 voicemails saying the house appraised well and I was being foolish to let it go so cheap. I deleted them without listening all the way through. My mother asked why I didn't stay longer. I said I'd gotten what I came for. She accepted that, mostly because I said it in a way that didn't invite follow-up questions. I still have the recipe box on my kitchen shelf, my grandmother's handwriting on the index cards. Sometimes, late at night when the apartment's quiet enough, I think about counting the scratches on those doors, whether the number would mean anything. Whether there's a number it would be better not to know. I never went back to count them. I think that was the right call. Story 3. The summer I turned 19, my older brother Deven and his friend Tomas Reyes decided it would be a great idea to spend a weekend at Tomas's uncle's fishing cabin up in the Kibler Flats area. I got invited mostly because Deven's girlfriend had bilayed on the trip at the last minute and they needed a third body for the gas money split. I didn't care. I'd spent that whole summer working at a call center, and the idea of 3 days without a headset felt like a miracle. The cabin was in decent shape, given that nobody had stayed there since the previous October. Tomas went up ahead of us to air it out and pick up a cooler of ice, and when Deven and I pulled in around 6 on a Friday, the place felt almost inviting, a wood stove going, lights on, the smell of pine through the open window above the sink. Tomas had left a bag of chips on the kitchen table and a note that said he'd gone to pick up bait and would be back in an hour. The lake was visible through the tree line, going pink in the evening light. I remember thinking this was going to be exactly what I needed. Tomas got back with bait and 2 six-packs, and we spent the first evening on the dock. We didn't catch anything, which was fine. The sky was clear and very full of stars. Tomas told a story about getting chased off a golf course when he was 14. Deven fell asleep in his chair before 10. It was a perfectly normal, comfortable night. The second day was also fine. I went into the tree line in the morning for maybe 20 minutes, just walking, and I found an old deer stand that hadn't been used in years, the wood gone gray and soft. There were beer cans around the base of it, weathered to that dull color where you can't read the label anymore. A child's shoe, inexplicably, sitting upright on a root. I stared at that shoe for a minute, trying to construct a reasonable explanation for it, and couldn't. And then I walked back to the cabin and told myself kids got up to weird stuff in the woods and left it there. That night is where things shifted. We had a fire going outside until maybe midnight, and then the wind came up and the smoke kept changing direction and blowing into our faces, so we gave up and went inside. Deven was asleep almost immediately. He's always been that way, out like a switch flipped. Tamaz stayed up reading on his phone. I was in the bunk closest to the window on the east wall, which looked out toward the tree line about 40 feet from the cabin. I don't know exactly when I noticed the figure. I'd been drifting in and out, that half-asleep state where you're aware of your surroundings but not quite processing them. I became aware that I was looking out the window, and that there was something standing at the tree line. I want to be careful about how I describe this, because I've gone over it so many times that I'm not sure anymore what I actually saw versus what my brain filled in afterward. What I know is this: there was a figure standing at the edge of the trees, roughly person-shaped, facing the cabin. The distance was enough that details were hard, but the moonlight was clear and bright, and I could see that the figure was taller than a person, though not by a lot, maybe 6.5 feet. Its arms were wrong. Not dramatically, not monster movie wrong. Just wrong enough that it took me a moment to understand what I was seeing. They hung too low, and there was an extra bend in them, like they had a joint where there shouldn't be one. I lay completely still. I didn't call out to Tamaz. I have no good explanation for why. Maybe some part of me thought if I pretended to be asleep, whatever it was would do the same. The figure didn't move. It just stood there. After maybe 5 minutes, I convinced myself it was a tree, a trick of the shadows. I turned over and faced the wall, and something about turning away from it felt deeply wrong, but I kept my eyes closed until I was actually asleep. In the morning, I told neither of them. Deven would have laughed. Tamaz would have been spooked enough to want to leave, and I didn't want to be responsible for cutting the trip short over what was probably nothing. We spent the morning fishing. I caught something and threw it back. Tamaz burned the lunch. Deven found a card game in the cabin drawer, and we played for a couple of hours. That second night, I did not sleep near the window. I woke up at what felt like 3 or 4 in the morning to a sound I can only describe as breathing, slow, deep breathing, very close. I was on the couch, which I'd pulled to the center of the room, away from all the windows. The breathing was coming from the north wall. I lay there with my eyes open in the dark and just listened. Tamaz was asleep in the bunk. Deven was in the back room. The breathing on the north wall continued for maybe 30 seconds, and then it stopped. Then something pressed against the outside of the cabin wall, not knocking, pressing. I could hear the old wood groan slightly under the pressure. The pressing moved slowly, like something exploring with flat palms, running them along the exterior slowly from one side to the other. It reached the window. The window shade moved. Not open, just flexed slightly inward, as if something outside was pressing its face against the glass. I grabbed Tamaz's arm and squeezed until he woke up. He started to say something, and I shook my head hard and pointed at the window. The shade was still. Whatever pressure had been on the glass was gone. But Tamaz looked at me and then at the window and then back at me, and I could see from his face that he'd heard it too, the pressing along the wall. We woke Deven up and told him we wanted to leave early. He was confused and annoyed, but he packed up because we outnumbered him. In the daylight, as Tamaz was loading the truck, he called me over to the north wall of the cabin. There were prints in the soft ground under the window, not footprints exactly. something more like the impressions a person's palms make when they press into soft ground side by side. The impressions were wider than a person's hands and too long, and they'd been pressed deep enough that even after a dry night they were still sharp-edged and clear. I got in the truck. I did not mention what I'd seen at the tree line the first night. I thought about whether that was the right call, whether we were safer in the cabin or in the truck, whether any of the choices we made that weekend were actually safe. I haven't been back to Kibler Flats. Tamaz's uncle sold the cabin the following year. I don't know why, I've never asked. Story 4. Growing up in Vestal, Georgia, you learn pretty early that there are parts of the county that just don't welcome you. Not in any way you can point to and explain. The land itself pushes back somehow. The light looks different, the sounds change, and some old instinct in you taps you on the shoulder and says this is not for you, keep moving. The place everyone knew about was the property on Duran Mill Road, about 4 miles outside of town. It had been a working mill back before anyone currently living was born, and then there was a fire. And after that, nobody did anything with it except let the kudzu take it. The old mill building was still there, not much more than 4 stone walls and no roof, but it stood. People went out there sometimes on dares, high school kids mostly. I'd been once when I was 16 during the day, and I'd lasted about 20 minutes before I got so uncomfortable I made up an excuse to leave. I was 31 when I had an actual reason to go back. My friend's mother, Patricia Ewan, ran a historical society out of Vestal, and she'd gotten a small grant to document local landmarks before the county commission started rezoning. She knew I did photography on the side, and she'd asked me in September if I'd be willing to go out to the mill site and take documentation photos. I said yes without thinking. I said yes partly because it was Patricia asking and I couldn't tell her no, and partly because I was 31 and I thought I was past being scared by old buildings. I went on a Tuesday in late October. I almost went on Monday, but I'd slept through my alarm. I wish, looking back, that I had gone on Monday, but I have no particular reason to think Monday would have been any different. It was overcast when I pulled off the road onto the old access lane, which was overgrown enough that I had to park and walk the last quarter mile. I had my camera bag and a flashlight because the stone walls kept the interior dark even in the daytime. I had a thermos of coffee that I'd burned my tongue on twice already that morning. I was wearing boots that were a little too stiff and had been giving me a blister on the left heel for about a week. None of that matters. I just remember those details clearly, the way you remember small things when the day turns out to be significant. The first thing I noticed when I got close to the mill was the quiet. I don't mean normal outdoor quiet. I mean the kind of total absence of ambient sound that takes a moment to consciously register. No birds, no insects, nothing moving in the kudzu. It was October, so the insects being quiet wasn't unreasonable. I told myself that. The interior of the mill was what you'd expect. Broken stone floor. Old timber collapsed in one corner. Kudzu growing down through the open roof and along the walls in thick green curtains. I spent maybe 40 minutes moving around the interior taking photographs, wide angles of the walls, detail shots of the stonework. A series of the old mill race opening where the stream had once come through, now choked with vegetation. I was crouching in the northwest corner, trying to get a low-angle shot of the remaining roof beam, when I noticed something in the kudzu along the west wall. At first I thought it was debris, trash someone had left, which wouldn't have been unusual. But as I looked at it longer, I recognized shapes. There were objects woven into the kudzu vines, not randomly. Deliberately placed, distributed at roughly even intervals along maybe 12 feet of wall, small bundles of dark material tied with what looked like cord, a few polished stones, and this is what I keep coming back to, an arrangement of what appeared to be finger bones, very small, threaded on a length of dark string and draped across the vines in a kind of loop. Human or animal, I honestly couldn't say. I wasn't going to touch them. The bones were old and yellowed, and the string they hung on looked newer. I took 2 photos, and then I stood up and walked to the entrance and stood in the open air for a few minutes trying to decide whether what I'd found was interesting or whether it was the kind of thing you just leave alone. I went back in. Professional stubbornness. I wanted to document the whole interior, and I told myself the bones were probably animal. The site had probably attracted teenagers who did weird stuff. I photographed the rest of the east wall and was packing my camera bag when I heard footsteps outside. The access lane came in from the south, and the footsteps were coming from the north, from deeper in the property where the woods thickened toward the creek. They were unhurried, clear on the dry leaves, getting closer. I moved to the entrance and looked out, and there was nothing on the lane. The footsteps continued from the north side of the building, then rounded the east wall, then stopped. I waited 30 seconds, a minute, nothing. I decided to leave. I'd gotten the shots I needed, more or less. I walked out the south entrance fast and got halfway to the access lane when I heard the footsteps again, now behind me from the direction of the mill entrance I'd just come out of. I turned around, nothing there. I made myself walk to the car, not run. I don't know why that distinction felt important. I kept my pace even. The footsteps followed me to within about 50 yards of the car and then stopped. I drove back to town and sat in the parking lot of the gas station for about 20 minutes before I felt like I could go have a normal conversation with Patricia about what I'd found. I showed her the photos of the bone arrangement. She looked at them for a long time without saying anything. Then she asked me which wall they were on, and when I told her the west wall, she nodded slowly in a way that suggested she wasn't surprised but wasn't going to explain herself either. I sent her the documentation photos. She sent a thank you note. I have not asked her what she knew, and she has not volunteered it. On my camera memory card, between the photos I took inside and the photos I took on the walk back out, there are 3 photos I don't remember taking. They're dark and slightly blurred, but they appear to be close-up shots of the access lane from ground level, like the camera was pointed down at the leaf litter. In the 3rd photo, at the very edge of the frame, there is what appears to be a bare human foot in motion walking away from the camera. The foot is very pale. The photo is slightly out of focus. I cannot tell if the blur is from motion or from something else. I still have the card. I don't know why I haven't deleted those photos. I think part of me is afraid that deleting them would be like acknowledging they exist. Story 5. I have a hard time talking about what happened in Faro Bend, partly because I know how it sounds and partly because there's a version of the story where I almost don't make it out, and I've never been completely comfortable with that. So bear with me, because I'm going to tell it the way it happened, not the way it would make sense. I was 25, driving back from a job interview in the city, and I took a wrong turn somewhere around mile marker 42 on Route 9, which I've done maybe 3 times total in my life and never with consequences. This time I ended up on a county road that wasn't on my phone's map. Not the kind where the map shows the road, but the GPS doesn't know the name, actually not on the map. No line. I was moving through landscape my phone thought was solid, unbroken land. The road was real though. 2-lane blacktop, a little cracked, with the yellow center line faded to near nothing. I figured it would loop back to something recognizable within a mile or 2. After about 4 miles, it deposited me in what turned out to be the unincorporated community of Faro Bend, which I later found out has a population of maybe 200 people and is not particularly notable for anything. I stopped at what appeared to be the only operating business in town, a combination gas station and bait shop with a single pump and a screen door that didn't close all the way. I needed to use the bathroom, and I figured I could ask about the fastest way back to Route 9. The man behind the counter was maybe 60, with a completely expressionless face and a hearing aid in his left ear, and when I asked about Route 9, he looked at me for a long moment before pointing east. He said to take the creek road and not to stop. I thanked him. I thought he meant traffic or that the road was rough. I found the creek road. I stopped. I stopped because there was a woman standing in the middle of the road about 100 yards ahead of me, standing completely still, facing my direction. She was wearing a dress that seemed too light for October, and she was not wearing shoes. I idled there for a moment, then pulled forward slowly and stopped again when I was maybe 50 feet from her, close enough to see her face clearly in my headlights. She was smiling. A wide, fixed smile that didn't involve the rest of her face at all, not her eyes, not her cheeks. And she was holding something against her chest with both hands, pressed to her sternum. A glass jar with the lid off, filled with dark liquid, held with the carefulness you give to something you don't want to spill. I rolled my window down. "You okay? You need help?" She tilted her head. The tilt was too far, more than 90 degrees, like a dog who'd heard a strange sound, like a neck that had no limit. Her eyes, when her head tilted, did not track with the movement. They stayed level. The head tilted, the eyes stayed fixed on me. I put the car in reverse. My hands were shaking badly enough that I missed the gear the first time and had to try again. She took one step toward me, then stopped. She opened her mouth and what came out was my name. Not a shout, not a question, just my name in a calm conversational voice like someone who knew me. I do not know how she knew my name. I have never found an explanation for that. I reversed fast enough that the tires broke loose on the gravel shoulder, and I drove back through town without stopping, through the stretch of unmarked county road, and I did not stop until I was back on Route 9 with my hazard lights on and a clear line of sight in every direction. I sat there for about 20 minutes. By the time I got home, I'd talked myself into a pretty solid set of rationalizations. Small town, local character. Maybe she'd heard my name from the man at the gas station, and I hadn't noticed. Maybe my name was also the name of someone she knew, and she wasn't talking to me at all. The neck thing was, I kept trying not to think about the neck thing. 3 days later, I was unpacking my jacket pocket, and I found a folded piece of paper I didn't recognize. I unfolded it. It was a hand-drawn map of Faro Bend, crude but identifiable, the creek road, the single main road, the gas station marked with a small X in the center of the creek road. At the spot where I'd stopped, someone had drawn a circle, and inside the circle they had drawn a figure standing with its arms at its sides. The figure's head was tilted at an angle impossible for a human neck. The paper was not in my pocket when I left for the interview. I was wearing that jacket the entire day. I have no explanation for when it would have been placed there. I threw it away. I regret that now, though I can't tell you why. Some part of me thinks it was meant as a warning. Some part of me thinks it was something else entirely. I've never been back to that stretch of Route 9. I'm not sure I could find Faro Bend again even if I tried, and I have no intention of trying. Story 6. The summer I was 22, my college roommate Priya Vashti and I drove out to see her family's old property near the Delmont Hollow area of Western Virginia. Priya's grandparents had owned about 40 acres out there before both of them died within a year of each other, and the land had been sitting untouched ever since because the family couldn't agree on what to do with it. Priya had never actually seen it. Her grandmother had described it in letters: a clearing, some old fruit trees, a stone foundation where the original farmhouse had stood. Priya wanted to see it before the family eventually sold it off, which everybody agreed was probably going to happen. I went because Priya asked, and because I genuinely thought it sounded like a nice trip. We packed lunch, we had good music for the drive, we stopped at a little roadside place and got peach milkshakes that were unbelievably good. I mention that because those milkshakes are the last thing I think about when I remember that day feeling normal. The property was about 2 miles off the county road down a rutted track that was just barely manageable with Priya's car. We parked where the track ended and walked in. The clearing Priya's grandmother had described was there, probably half an acre of open grass, slightly overgrown, surrounded by old forest. The fruit trees were there too, gnarled and producing nothing but a few wizened crab apples. The stone foundation was there, a low rectangle of mossy granite just above the grass line. The clearing was pretty, that's the honest thing. It was a warm day, light coming down through the surrounding trees in shafts, and it felt like a place someone had loved. Priya took some photos on her phone. I sat on a part of the foundation and ate an apple from our bag. We didn't talk much. It was the kind of place that made you quiet without knowing why. We'd been there maybe an hour when Priya said she wanted to walk the tree line to see how far the property extended. I said I'd wait in the clearing. She had her phone, it was broad daylight, it was her family's land, there was nothing to be concerned about. She was gone maybe 15 minutes. I was sitting on the foundation, watching a hawk circle somewhere above the trees, thinking about whether I needed a career change, when I noticed that the clearing had gotten quiet. Not the normal kind of quiet. The birds that had been making background noise since we arrived had stopped all at once. I noticed the stopped sound the way you notice when music cuts out in the middle of a song. I stood up. At the far north edge of the clearing, where the grass met the tree line, there was something standing in the shadow of the trees. I could just make it out, still and low, like it was crouching or kneeling at the margin where the shadow started. I stared at it for a long time, trying to understand what I was seeing. A large animal, I thought. A deer bedding down, though I'd never seen a deer hold that completely still for that long while a person was nearby. Then it moved. It didn't stand up, it sort of unfolded piece by piece in a way that took longer than it should have. First the torso came up, and then the arms came out to the sides, and then it was standing but facing away from me into the trees. It was roughly the height of a person. Its posture was slightly wrong, shoulders too squared, head angled down. It took one step into the trees and then stopped. Then it turned its head, just its head, rotating further than any neck should allow until it was looking almost directly behind itself. Looking at me, I didn't scream. I think I would have screamed if the shock hadn't overridden it. What I did was back up slowly until the foundation was between me and the tree line, which was not logical but felt necessary. The figure moved into the trees. Gone. Priya came back about 5 minutes later. She could tell from my face that something was wrong, and she asked what had happened. I told her. She stood there looking at the north tree line for a moment, and then she said very quietly that her grandmother had written in one of her letters about something at the edge of the property that she called a watcher. She'd always assumed it was the grandmother's way of describing the feeling of being observed, the way old properties sometimes made you feel, like anthropomorphizing the land's memory. We left. We didn't run, but we didn't take our time either. 3 weeks later, when Priya was going through her grandmother's letters more carefully, she found a specific one dated from the 1980s. Her grandmother had written, "The watcher was at the north line again last evening. As long as you don't go to where the creek turns, it will only look." She had written it as casually as you'd write about a neighbor's dog that wandered into the yard. Priya sent me a photo of that letter. I've read it probably 60 times. The part that won't leave me is the qualifier. As long as you don't go to where the creek turns. I don't know where the creek turns. I have never wanted to find out. But some nights I'm certain that it knows I was there in that clearing. That for however long I sat on that foundation eating an apple and watching a hawk, something at the tree line was watching me back, waiting to see if I would make the wrong choice. I didn't, I'm glad, but there's a version of that afternoon where Priya says, "Let's follow the creek," and I say sure, and the rest of the story ends differently. I think about that version sometimes, how close I was to it without knowing. Story 7. Last story. This one's harder to tell because it happened the most recently, only about 3 years ago, and there are parts of it I'm still working through. I grew up in a town called Wicks Crossing, which sits at the bottom of a valley in central Oregon and has exactly one traffic light, a volunteer fire department, and a diner called Me's that has been open since 1961. I moved away at 18, came back at 34 when my father needed help after his surgery, and ended up staying through the winter because that's how things go sometimes. You come back for 6 weeks, and suddenly it's February and you've resubscribed to the small-town rhythms you spent your youth trying to escape. My father, once he was recovered enough to complain about me hovering, told me to go find something to do with myself. He suggested visiting the Cross farm about 8 miles out the East Valley Road, where Heidi Cross, he went to school with her daughter, had been managing the property alone since her husband passed and could probably use a hand winterizing the outbuildings. I went because I needed the activity and because I remembered Heidi vaguely from when I was young, a tall woman with a steady way of looking at you that made you feel assessed and not minded. Heidi met me in the driveway and gave me coffee that was actually good, not the burnt or too-weak kind you usually got from being a guest, but the kind made by someone who took it seriously. We talked for a while. She had a sheepdog named something I can't remember that kept putting its head on my knee. There were wind chimes on the porch that made a sound like someone absent-mindedly running a finger along the rim of a glass. Normal morning, everything easy. The outbuildings were a barn, a machinery shed, and an old smokehouse at the far south end of the property that Heidi said hadn't been used since her husband's father ran the place. She wanted all 3 weatherproofed before the cold set in. We worked through the barn and the machinery shed over a couple of days, and then we got to the smokehouse. It was a small building, maybe 10 feet square, with a low doorway you had to duck through and one small window high on the north wall that had been boarded up from the outside. Inside it was very dark, smelled like old ash and something else I couldn't name, not exactly organic, more like the smell of static electricity, metallic and dry. There were old hanging hooks rusted in the ceiling, a stone fire pit in the center, long cold. The walls were dark with decades of smoke residue. On the east wall, at about chest height, there was a horizontal crack in the old wood where 2 boards had separated with age. I noticed it because light was coming through it, not much, just a thin line. I put my flashlight beam along the crack to assess it for weather sealing. Through the crack from outside the building, something looked back. I'm going to say that again because I need you to understand it literally. I put my eye close to assess the gap, and from the other side of that gap, a few inches from my face, there was an eye looking in. Dark, very still, no white visible around it. Just the iris and the dark, watching me through a 2-inch gap in old wood. I stepped back so fast I hit the wall behind me. I held my light on the crack. The eye did not move. After a moment it shifted, not the whole head moving, just the eye like it was adjusting its position, tracking the light. Then it was gone. I went around the outside of the smokehouse fast. The crack was on the east wall, which faced the open field, no hedgerow, no cover for 30 yards in any direction. There was nothing on the other side of the wall, no prints in the soft November ground except my own from walking around. The field was empty. I went back inside and looked at the crack from the inside with the flashlight against the wood. I could see through it clearly, completely clear line of sight through to the field. I told Heidi I'd come back to finish the smokehouse another day. I said something had come up. She looked at me with that assessing look and didn't push it. I drove home. I told my father I'd helped Heidi winterize and didn't mention the smokehouse, and he seemed satisfied. A week later, helping Heidi with something else entirely, fence posts, nothing that required going near the south end of the property, she mentioned, in the same tone UD used to mention weather, that she didn't like to spend much time around the smokehouse herself. Said her husband used to say the same. Said his father, the one who'd actually used it, had eventually stopped, and when her husband once asked why, the old man had apparently said, "Because whatever lived in the smoke came to expect a place at the door." I didn't respond. She didn't look at me when she said it, just kept working on the fence post. And then we moved on and talked about something else. I finished my time in Wicks Crossing and drove back north in early March. I don't know what the current status of the smokehouse is. I don't know what I saw through that gap. I don't know if what lived in the smoke is a saying that means something specific, or if it was just an old man's way of talking around something he'd never had the words for. What I know is that when I woke up the morning after the smokehouse, there was a smell in my old bedroom that I recognized. Not strong, not overwhelming. Just there in the corner near the window when I first opened my eyes, that metallic, dry smell like static electricity, like old ash, like the inside of a small dark building at the south end of a field. It was gone by the time I'd been awake 5 minutes. I haven't smelled it since. I try to believe that means something. Thanks for watching. If these stories got under your skin, and I hope at least one of them did, hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Drop a comment and tell me which story stayed with you longest, and share this with someone you want to keep up at night. Until next time, stay close to the light and be careful about what roads you take home.